You said you wanted to do a video on inflation.
Oh my goodness, not that kind of inflation. Hello, this is MassInform, and we're going to be talking about inflation today, and what inflation is, and then our opinion about, how inflation hurts, helps, and how you can make a difference. So I'll go over generally what inflation is, and then there are two specific parts. One where it's general inflation based on normal commodity prices, and then there's another part where the government can cause inflation. So I'll start with the general inflation. And so essentially, let's say you wanted to buy milk. So milk has to be produced. So somebody has to have cows, somebody has to get feed for the cows, which then somebody has to go make, right? So there's a whole bunch of labor that's involved in just making something as simple as milk, which then gets pasteurized, cleaned, and put in cartons and shipped off in trucks that somebody has to make and all that stuff, and then gets put into a grocery store that you go and then buy that milk. So there's a whole bunch of people that are involved in making that happen, right? From the gasoline that goes into the truck to the farm equipment that goes into making the feed, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of people that get. So your little contribution to that is, you pay what, $2-3 for your milk. That goes to so many people out in the world, right? That did a lot of work, but they did a little chunk for you, right? And that's the normal way we sell and buy stuff, right? You need to consume, somebody needs to produce. Now, let's say, for instance, the number of cows that produce milk is somehow reduced because there's some disease, some cow disease happens, and okay, well, we can't produce as much milk. Well, at that point, the number of people who want milk will probably stay the same, so they'll ask for more than is available. So usually that causes an inflation in price, because the supply just isn't meeting the demand, and all we can really do is say, for the scarce resource, we'll give it to the person willing to pay more for it, right? So that's generally how you'll see inflation in a market situation. The other thing that could happen is cows could somehow become extinct. Let's hope that doesn't happen, but it could happen, right? In that case, anything that's left would be extremely expensive, because there'd be a diminishing supply that can never be replenished, right? Unless you decide to use something else to generate the milk, right? So those are potential ways that inflation can occur in a normal market situation. You can have a disruption, or you can have a sudden spike in demand. Maybe a whole country is now uplifted out of poverty, and they suddenly have the ability to consume stuff that they didn't have before, and you suddenly have this spike in demand, and you have to somehow meet that demand, and it'll cause an inflation in price. There's also potential of deflation in price, where somebody just doesn't want anything anymore, and you keep making it, and like, oh crap, now I need to sell this stuff. What do I do with it? So you just decrease the cost, so that people will be enticed to maybe pick it up at a lower cost, right? So those are two potential ways that you have inflation and potential deflation. But now there's the government part of it. Do you want to go over that, John?
Absolutely. So the government part of it consists of two things. The first thing is what we call M2, or the total amount of money that's in our government. And the government has control over that amount, that volume that we have. And the way they control it is something called the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has the right, the exclusive right, to print off the money for the United States. This controls how many dollars are actually in circulation at any one given point in time. The other part of that is how much our services and goods are worth. So our goods and services, some people like to use the gross domestic product, GDP, to determine this, is every time you and I do something, we create a new tool, we make a product for sale, or we provide a service such as turn down service, or if we do massage therapy, each one of those generates revenue by having someone else pay us to do those things or purchase our goods. And then we in turn go and purchase more goods or more services. Because those transactions are tracked in very broad general terms, that amount is how much our GDP is worth. That, divided by our total volume of money, gives us roughly how much our dollar is worth. So if our value of products and services grows, and our volume of money, our M2 amount of money that's around, stays the same, our dollar becomes worth more, because our goods and services are worth more. We have more of it. We are expanding as an economy. If the opposite happens, if our amount of products and services stay roughly the same, but the amount of money we have expands, well, then there's more dollars for the same amount of goods, which means that each dollar is worth a little bit less. And this is where we get a little bit of inflation. We could also, for deflation, go the opposite way, where if the government just decides to cut the amount of new money it's making, at the same time getting rid of old dollars at the same rate, and our GDP is staying the same or shrinking, then we could see our dollar deflate. Generally, the government can't do too much for inflation other than controlling the money. For example, the GDP they can have some impact on, but not a lot. They can create some regulations to prevent you from opening a new market. Let's say tomorrow, for no reason, they decide to stop electric cars. If they did that, they would hurt the amount of goods and services that were going on. That would shrink our GDP, creating a little bit of inflation. On the other hand, they could decide to make $1 trillion new dollars. They could just print them off, put them into circulation, let them go. Well, that would mean that we have a lot more dollars and the same amount of goods and services, and that would cause our dollars to be worth less.
Now, doesn't that sound like quantitative easing? I think that's exactly what they did.
Quantitative easing, inflational easing. But there are other ways that the government can affect inflation. For example, taxation.
Yep.
So for taxation, what the government does is it actually requires people to give them a portion of some of their goods and services for sales. And they do that in a dollar amount. So if you go and buy a balloon, for example, if this is $5 and you have to pay a 10% tax, then 50% has to go to Uncle Sam. When they do that, they're taking money out of the markets and they're bringing it into the government. And that goes to pay for that amount of money that they're making every year. At the same time, they're taking that out of our goods and services. They're taking it out of our GDP. And because of that, there's a little bit less going on with our markets. This is something that some people talk about calling the Laffer curve. If you go and look at the Laffer curve, it tells you at some point, if you tax at 0%, the government gets $0 and the markets run rampant. If you tax at 100%, the government also gets 0 because no one has money to make goods and services. Somewhere in between that curve, there's the ideal amount you should tax somebody in order for the markets to operate at optimum capacity and the government to take in the most amount of money. Everyone disagrees on what that number is. Conservatives will say it should be less. So a liberal should say you should take more, and that's fine. Everyone has their opinion on that, and we can look at history to figure out which one's true, which one's false, and how we should proceed in the future. But for the most part, just for a general understanding, the more money the government takes out of the market, the less money the market has to create new goods and services, less innovation, so we can't expand our GDP.
Yeah, so let's take that and then say, well, what does inflation do to the average person, right? So, if it's market-based inflation, there may be no ill impact, or there may be huge ill impact if it's, say, a famine, right? There's a potential that we can't generate the crops needed for people to sustain themselves. That's a potential, and that's a huge impact. If it's something like you won't get, I don't know, some newfangled entertainment device. Okay, it's not the end of the world, but it might be inconvenient, right?
Yeah.
But it's not like it's going to cause you to not sustain yourself. If we somehow lost the ability to generate wood for making homes, okay, that would be huge, right? If we suddenly lost the ability to generate oil, which people just assume is we can just move to something else. No, there's so much of an industry around that where you get your medicines, your plastics, the roads you drive on. There's so many things that you get because of oil. And coal, for that matter. If we didn't have coal for steel production, that would be a huge detriment to our economy and to our ability to defend ourselves, right? So there's just so many little things that happen, right? So if those go down, it causes ripples. So those can cause everyday, normal things for you to become a problem.
Yeah.
So if you just need to heat your home, well, that's happening somehow, whether it's natural gas, electricity that we generate through some means, usually through some sort of coal or oil, or now we're doing a little solar, but a lot of that has generally been those kinds of things.
Yep.
That can cause an impact to you as far as cost, right? So these are all inflationary things that can just happen because of markets and pressures, right? The government can create its pressure and say, I don't know, we're going to charge extra for you using coal versus, say, natural gas. That can happen, fine, and they may have good reasons to do it, but it does mean the bottom line for you is going to be that you have to pay more. And so that's an inflation to you, right? So more cost to you for just everyday living. So those kind of things can be a major impact. The interesting one is when the government does it in printing money. It may not be apparent what they're doing, but it hurts you nonetheless. You want to go into maybe how that happens?
Absolutely. So when the government creates inflation, what it's doing is it's creating more money. And as we said before, when you create more money, you devalue the dollar. You bring down its values because the government can't make more goods and services just appear out of thin air. It doesn't happen. So when that happens, what the government's really doing is it's taxing you. If you're making $50,000 a year right now, and they increase inflation, fictitious numbers, 10%, then your money is worth 10% less, which means that your spending power is 10% less. Your capability of making a better life is 10% less. Well, where does that money go? Well, the government spent it. It originally built up this money. It prints off this money for things like a $1.5 trillion tax cut, or to pay for Obamacare, or to pay for a bridge to nowhere, or whatever they're printing that money off of. They're just printing it now, spending it, and then taking it from you. It's kind of a backwards way of thinking about taxation, but it absolutely is diminishing your ability to make money and at the same time allowing them to spend it.
Right. So, I mean, if you want to think about it, when you spend money, if the government spends money, it's taking away somebody's labor and allocating it to what they want, right?
Yes.
In the other way, if they only spend the amount that we're giving them, the rest of it is our transaction with the labor market to say, well, this is what I want,
Yes.
right? Whereas the government's saying, I'm just going to go print money, and whether you want it or not, I'm going to take that labor that you might have went and spent, in the 10% case, $5,000 on out of your 50,000. I'm just going to go take that labor and do whatever I want, and you can't spend that 5,000. So your 50,000, whatever they let you have, is now going to be less value because you can spend all of it you want on the stuff they left you, right? The stuff they took it. It's gone. And that is where the inflation comes in. It just takes away the labor from what you might want versus what they want. And if they just tax you for it, then it stays equal. We just can't buy the things we want because that labor is being allocated to things that we might need. That's totally fair. The government does things on our behalf. So fine, we may need that, but it's just better to just pay it up front, know that, hey, this is just allocated to the government. This is the amount of labor we're allocating to the government versus surreptitiously, they just do it in the background anyway. And then you just feel the effect of it. And that generally tends to show up as things feel like they're not as easy to do year to year. You can't buy as much as you could last year or like 5 years ago, and you just find like your bills are just piling up more and more because you just can't seem to catch up. That's how it shows up. It's just things just become more and more expensive for the things that you just do every day anyway.
Yep.
And that's what you would see.
But what some people don't understand is they hear things like deficit spending,
Yep.
or they'll hear the printing of more money. They don't understand what the government's actually doing.
Yep.
The Federal Reserve is the branch of the government that actually prints off the money.
Yep.
And they are highly unregulated. They do have minor oversight by the executive branch, but not a whole lot. So the Federal Reserve was built in 1907, and the idea was they needed someone to have one group that just prints the money and then have the ability to print a little bit extra or a little bit less depending on what's going on at the time. Sometimes there might be a downturn in the market and they want to spend a little bit more money to bring that back up, or they might want to bring it down to bring out speculation in the dollar. This was an idea that they came up with, and then in the 1920s and 30s, they started using it a lot. So in order for the government to buy things like the Eisenhower dam, they had deficit spending. In order to pay off some of the tax cuts that we have, deficit
Was it
spending.
the Hoover Dam you mean? Or
Sorry, Hoover Dam.
Yes, not Eisenhower. A little later.
I was off by a couple decades. But you know what I'm saying? It's always going to be a government expenditure that they want to cover with funds they don't currently have.
Yep.
And so what they do is they go to the Federal Reserve and say, print off this money. And then that creates an inflation on us. So although they're allowed to spend the money at the time that it's worth a certain amount, by the time we get our money the year after, our income's worth less.
Yep. Now, there is an alternative to this, and we still tend to use it here and there where, before we did that, you just would issue bonds and say, okay, I want to borrow money from the people that I will pay interest on and eventually pay it back. And that model still exists. However, it is supplanted with the ability to just simply print money. It's just easier to just say, oh, I have a shortfall. I'll just print more money, instead of actually trying to find revenue source from by lending out to other people. This, by the way, is part of the cycle of having the interest rate be extremely low as well, which is another part that the government does. As part of the Fed was to have a rate at which they will lend to private banks who can then lend back to the government or to other people. And that rate they determine usually is within 0.25% or 0.5% of what the private industry will use. And that rate should not be determined by the government. It should be determined by the supply of funds. So in general, when you decide not to spend your money and instead put it in a bank, the bank can then on your behalf go lend it to somebody and try to gain value for it, for you and for them, right? Yes. So, but that's not what's happening anymore. Now the government just lends money that's been printed, and somehow that's supposed to absolve itself in reality, but it doesn't. As we were saying, it's, as people come into the labor market, you can have a little bit of slack, but it doesn't happen that it will be 20% slack, and that's what generally the government keeps doing. They'll just print 5%, 10%, like, okay, slow down, we don't have enough to cover this.
And just so people at home, so you understand how this affects you. So this past year, we just got the report that it was a 3.1% increase in wages. 3.1%, that's the highest we've seen in a decade. People have been complaining about flat wages for a long time. Completely true. Completely true. But the 3.1% growth that we saw in our wages is almost entirely wiped out by inflation. You gain 3.1%, but if the government causes an inflation of 3%, you really didn't make much.
And unfortunately, you're back to flat.
And you're back to flat.
So, unfortunate. But I guess this was going to come anyways, right? So I wouldn't specifically blame the current administration. Like, we were printing money with quantitative easing for like the last 8-10 years. It's just been constant. And we've been doing deficit spending ever since we started the wars.
Yes.
So we really need to kind of, solidify ourselves. So as an electorate, we can ask our government to not do this.
Yes.
But understand that it is very effective for them and convenient for them to continue to do this. Give us a tax cut, and then go ahead and spend the money because it looks like we're getting money, but really we're not.
Exactly.
And so if we wanted to get this fixed, we'd have to say, no, we want you to just tax us at the appropriate rate, or please reduce your spending and make it so that the government is, flat on its revenue plus expenditure. So you're not borrowing, you're not printing money. You just take from us what you need and go make that happen. And then if you need to pay off the debt, which would be awesome, you might need to pull a little bit more and then start paying off that debt.
But you hit on something that's very important. I want to talk to people about this as well. Things that people can do in their own personal lives in order to help. No one here is going to solve inflation or even debt, but no one here is going to solve inflation. You can go to your elected officials and say, hey, look, this is a big issue for me. We would be living such a better life if we didn't do this deficit spending, if we didn't just print money like it was paper, because it is.
It is, yeah.
But what we can do is a couple of things. Yes, you can go to your elected officials. I agree with that. Yeah. Love it. It'd be a great idea if they thought that a majority of people want to rein in spending or at least not print off a ton of money.
Yep.
That would be great. But there is one part that people don't normally think about that I want you to think about. You can do it by fulfilling your dreams. The entrepreneurial spirit makes people want to go out and build something new. Geet and I started this whole concept of a YouTube channel and this company of MassInform and MassInform with the idea of putting out knowledge and our opinions and thinking about things. But it's an entrepreneurial spirit that drives us to keep trying to build this into more than what it is. When we do that, we create more services and goods. And by doing that, we increase the value of America. Now, the amount that we do is minute. But if everybody would partake in this and try to build something more, to go off and either start a business, start a part-time job, or maybe just even create a YouTube channel with more services on there, any little bit that you want to do can help.
Yep.
This creates incentive for other people to do it because when they hear your success story, they'll want to do it too. And the more goods and services we have out there, first of all, more robust our markets become, and you'll have more choices of what you want to purchase. That'll drive down costs. But even more so, you'll be creating an incentive for our dollar to go up in value.
Yeah, and I guess another thing of hope is to say that, instead of fearing change, which will happen no matter what,
no matter what you
do, the point of doing more automation or making things that are more labor intensive, less labor intensive, is to free us up to do things that might be more interesting. Mm-hmm. So we should try not to fear the change. Instead, make sure we know that's coming, and then position ourselves to be able to do something of more value to society as a whole. It could be as simple as this. This is good enough potential for people to survive. There are plenty of people on YouTube that make a living by just doing YouTube videos, and that's fine. But there are many other things you can do that could be of value. It could, as long as you can find a way that customers of yours could, would want what you want, you've now increased the value available to the country and to the world, for that matter. And that's how GDP increases. Generally, we try to decrease the cost for a given good or service, and then that frees up people to do more stuff, and so we produce more value in the same given time, and that's generally how GDP increases, right? It's just that more products and services are created versus last year because we made the products that we were doing last year more efficient.
Yeah.
So that's great if we think of it in those terms. The downside is usually that means people are losing jobs. And if you only look at it that way, then you're not looking at the hopeful way to say, well, those folks can then go do something different, and hopefully they will, and that's where entrepreneurial spirit comes in.
Yes.
Just keep looking for ways, just simple things you might do every day, and say, this is bogus. Why isn't there some way to do this better? And just go out there and make it happen, right? Just push yourself, make it happen.
Exactly. So go out there, chase your dreams, kill inflation.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Well, this was a video from MassInform. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments or would like to support us, please visit us on
Twitter, Facebook, Patreon. Links will all be below in the description. You can also leave us a comment, and if you have something you want us to cover, comment down below as well.
Thanks again. Goodbye.